Hi, I'm Phil. This is a video. I go by Cosmic Horror Cowboy here on YouTube, and I'm gonna make a video about the cosmic horror part. I'm gonna see if I can get it done in one day. I doubt I can, but I really want to get back to playing Baldur's Gate 3. I hear that man's reach should exceed his grasp, else what's a Tuesday for? I wrote that down. It's on a cue card. Trying to do cue cards. I don't know how they're gonna go. We're done with that one. Okay, what is cosmic horror? Well, it's a broad definition, and before we get into anything like that, I should probably start with just saying all genres is excuses to put up bookshelves. If bookstores could figure out a way to split every book into its own category, they would. They're making them up. We can create as many categories as we want, and we can make as many assessments about them as we need to do. And that's very useful. But it's important to remember all these are made-up categories. There is nothing that makes something cosmic horror over sci-fi, over fantasy. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about could qualify as dark fantasy. The categories are made up. That said, let's look at some of the qualities that make this category an interesting one. So what is cosmic horror? Well, it is grappling with the unknown. I got that here. It is a distrust of science. It's marked by wrestling with ideas of modernism and scientific progress versus a religious way of life and religious way of viewing the world. It also tends to evoke a sense of terror or awe or kind of what Goethe refers to as the numinous. Basically, the spirit, the ghost of a big, scary world. That's cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is a loose definition, but it became very famous in the 1920s and 30s by Howard Phillips Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft was working with Weird Tales, a pulp publication that was putting out stuff like Conan the Barbarian and the Cull the Atlantean series by Robert E. Howard, a collaborator and colleague of Lovecraft's who was very, very much doing a kind of mythopoetics of a world in reaction to the kind of scientific reconstruction of history that was taking place in the early 20th century. This was very obvious in the work they were putting out, very conscious in the type of concepts they were writing. They were also super racist and super, super unscientific. So Howard and Lovecraft are both engaged in a kind of a mythopoetics, wrestling with their ideas of what human nature should and could be, and the more scientific issues of the day. The problem with that, among other things, is that the science of the day wasn't great, right? We've moved forward in our science, and still, people refer to Lovecraft and Howard's work as a kind of a gold standard for the kind of concepts about space and about fantasy and about what we could do. Contemporary cosmic horror and dark fantasy has to reckon with these out-of-date scientific ideas. And I believe, personally, that it behooves any fantasy author or aspiring fantasy author to not only be educated in the canon of their own genre, but to expand their interests into anthropology, into history, into socioeconomic issues. Whatever happens to be your passion, you kind of owe it to yourself to learn about the contemporary issues rather than just putting out the same kind of imaginations that are a response to the scientific concepts of 100 years ago. So much of our contemporary fantasy is based on out-of-date political and social ideas. Game of Thrones, or A Song of Ice and Fire, the George R.R. Martin epic, is one of the great epics of our era, whether it ever gets finished or not. If all it ever ends up being is a television franchise, it will still have shaped more people's opinions about fantasy than probably anything since The Lord of the Rings. Its own video. Lord of the Rings is at least 2 videos of its own. A Song of Ice and Fire reflects a certain socio-political leaning. It takes the ideas of fantasy and makes them quote-unquote realistic. But like, realistic in the sense of introducing realpolitik that Henry Kissinger would get a boner from. This is like baby's first neorealism. It's a concept of political engagement that's very useful, but very limiting. It takes ideas of great man theory that were framed around Europe around the 20th century and doesn't really make sense in a global system, much less a fantastical one. That doesn't mean that Game of Thrones is bad, but it does mean that its story is always going to be a little bit basic. There are plenty of things George R. R. Martin does very well, but his politics is definitely overhyped. Some folks are an exception to that kind of hidebound rigidity towards out-of-date history. For example, Steven Erikson does things with anthropology and deep time and race that are fascinating and can really only be done in speculative fiction. Even Brandon Sanderson, who is both a very accessible author and a person of faith, engages with biblical critical studies and religious criticism in a way that's far more complicated than at first it might look. Now, you might say that I'm overreacting to the kind of ideas that people are putting in their dark fantasy, in their science fiction, and in their cosmic horror. And yeah, I guess that's fair. The problem with ideas is that sometimes people believe them. The number of times I have been on a message board and seen some fantasy bro waxing lyrical about guns, germs, and steel. Look, I'm not saying it's a bad history book, but it's certainly not something to cite as gospel. If your entire framework of fantasy is shaped by colonialist and imperialist messaging, your story is going to be less interesting. We live in an increasingly complicated world, and we need a better class of fantasist. Let's see if I can get this done in one day.